A police officer inherited a forgotten airfield from a man he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Locals mocked him, calling it a rusted graveyard for warplanes. But when his old German Shepherd began frantically clawing at the cargo bay of a World War II plane, something felt different. Inside, they didn't find tools or spare parts. They found a sealed wooden crate, a handwritten letter, and a secret that had been buried for nearly 80 years. A secret that could bring entire families back to life, not in body, but in memory. What happens next will restore your faith in loyalty, history, and the bond between a man and his dog. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe that no piece of history and no loyal dog should ever be forgotten, hit that subscribe button. Because this story may just remind you, sometimes the bravest heroes walk on 4 legs. A low mist clung to the earth like memory, refusing to let go. The early morning fog drifted lazily over Sea Haven, a forgotten coastal town in Oregon where gulls called through thick clouds and the smell of salt clung to every wooden beam. Spring should have smelled like wildflowers, but here it smelled of rust, seaweed, and something ancient. Detective Daniel Hayes, 42, shifted in his truck seat as he rolled to a stop before the tall, chain-linked fence of the decommissioned airfield. He was tall, broad-shouldered but lean, with gray dusting his short dark hair and crow's feet notched into the corners of his storm-gray eyes. His face looked carved from quiet grief, the kind that doesn't ask for sympathy. He wore a faded police department windbreaker over a plain Henley, jeans, and boots scuffed by more than pavement. Just yesterday, in the precinct break room, he'd stood quietly by the coffee pot when Officer Travis, a heavy-set man with a permanent smirk, nudged a rookie and chuckled, "You hear Hayes inherited a whole airfield? Hope he's got a tetanus shot. Probably just rust, ghosts, and bird crap." Laughter followed, not cruel, not warm either, just the kind that filled space. Daniel hadn't answered. He just poured his black coffee and walked out, as he often did. They didn't understand. Not really. His world had gotten smaller 5 years ago, when Emily, his wife, had passed away suddenly from a brain aneurysm. One morning, she was laughing over scrambled eggs. That night, she was gone. No goodbye, no warning. Since then, Daniel had folded inward, stopped attending gatherings, sold their house, and moved into a 1-bedroom cabin on the outskirts of town. The only one who followed him from the old life was Max. Max sat in the passenger seat now, ears twitching, eyes sharp. A 10-year-old German Shepherd, Max bore the grizzled dignity of age. Sable coat streaked with silver, his left ear slightly folded from an old injury, and a faint scar along his right hind leg. He was a retired canine, once fierce and fast, now slower but just as alert, loyal beyond question. Max didn't bark unless it mattered, and today his hackles were already starting to rise. Daniel cut the engine and let silence settle. Beyond the fence, the Sea Haven Naval Airfield stretched like a graveyard. Rusted hangars crouched low beneath moss-draped roofs, crumbling runways webbed with cracks, and the skeletal hulks of aircraft loomed under tarps that time had forgotten. A sign, crooked on its hinges, still read, "Federal property, no entry." Beneath it, someone had spray-painted in red, "Boneyard of Wings." He stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. Max leapt down beside him, nose already twitching, body alert. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter again. Thick, cream-colored, bearing the embossed seal of Abernathy and Doyle law offices. Inside, the words hadn't changed since yesterday, but the weight of them hadn't lessened. In accordance with the last will and testament of Captain Richard Kane, you are hereby the sole inheritor of the Sea Haven Naval Airfield, all structures and contents therein. Captain Richard Kane. The name landed like an echo in Daniel's chest. Kane had been more than a superior officer. In Daniel's early years as a patrolman, Kane had been the one to pull him aside, challenge his assumptions, shape his instincts, and teach him to think beyond orders. Gruff, brilliant, and fiercely principled, Kane never played politics. But he taught Daniel how to see through people. They'd lost touch after Kane retired, and now, without so much as a farewell, Kane had left him this. Daniel twisted the padlock with the key the firm had sent. It clicked open with the reluctant groan of disuse. Max pushed ahead slightly, his body low, tail stiff, as if sensing something in the air that didn't belong. "Easy," Daniel murmured. Max gave no response. The gate groaned open. Beyond it, a wind stirred, rustling through broken fencing and dragging old warning flags in lazy circles. They passed rows of dismembered aircraft, some gutted, others half covered in faded tarps. One hangar stood open, revealing a skeletal fuselage and the smell of long-dead fuel. Daniel paused, taking it in, the weight of rust and history pressing on his chest. He remembered Kane once saying, "Some legacies aren't trophies. They're burdens people died to carry." Max suddenly stopped. His body went stiff, head low, ears up. Daniel followed his gaze. A weather-worn C-47 Skytrain, parked in the open near the far edge of the field. The aircraft, though rusted and faded, still bore faint military markings. Its once proud frame sagged under the weight of time. Max trotted toward it, cautiously at first, then quicker. He circled the plane, sniffing near the undercarriage, then stopped near the loading ramp. He barked. Once. Short, urgent. Daniel's stomach tightened. "You smell something?" he asked, approaching the plane. Max pawed at the bottom edge of the ramp, then stood still, tail rigid. The door was jammed but gave way with effort. Inside was darkness thick with dust and the bitter tang of old oil. Shafts of light pierced through a cracked window above, slicing the gloom into fractured gold. Daniel stepped in, his boots thudding softly on metal. Max followed, ears perked. The interior was stripped. No seats, no cargo, only the skeletal frame and a musty tarp rolled into the corner. But Max wasn't interested in the corner. He sniffed around the center of the hold, then pawed the floor, once, then twice, and whined. Daniel crouched. The floor had been repaneled at some point. Rough screws, newer bolts, just this section. Max let out a low rumble, then looked up at Daniel with his amber eyes, not fear, not warning. Something else. Expectation. Something was under there. But Daniel didn't investigate further, not yet. His gut told him this wasn't just about old memories. There was something Kane had left behind. Something worth hiding, and Max had just led him to it. He stepped out into the daylight, heart thudding. Fog still curled around the landing strips, but something else stirred inside Daniel, the feeling he hadn't known in years. Purpose. The interior of the C-47 held its breath. Dust thickened the air like sleep, every surface layered in cobwebs, as if the years had exhaled and never inhaled again. The only sounds inside the cargo bay were the soft tapping of Max's claws on metal and Daniel's cautious footfalls as he moved toward the center of the plane. Max didn't stop. His paw scratched insistently at a specific panel of the floor, the claws chipping flecks of rust away, revealing a darker shade of metal beneath. Daniel knelt, brushing his hand along the spot. The steel felt colder somehow, untouched by the warmth of the day. As more paint peeled off under his fingers, something emerged. Not a word, but a shape. A pair of wings cradling a 5-pointed star etched directly into the surface. He tilted his head. Military, not standard. The carving was precise, deliberate, not industrial stamping. This was done by hand. Max let out a low whine and sat back, his eyes never leaving the symbol. Daniel traced the lines again with his thumb. The image stirred something in his chest, not memory, but recognition without context, like a tune hummed in a dream. He pulled out his phone and took a few pictures before slowly rising to his feet. The air felt thicker now. The silence in the plane wasn't empty. It was waiting. Outside, the fog had begun to thin, sun breaking through in long slants, catching on the jagged tail fins of rusting aircraft. Daniel closed the plane's ramp and latched it with care. He didn't know why. Maybe respect. Maybe instinct. Back at the truck, Max jumped into the passenger seat with a grunt, settling in with his usual slow, deliberate dignity. Daniel glanced one last time at the looming silhouette of the C-47 before starting the engine. He didn't have answers, but he had a question now, and that was more than he'd had yesterday. He drove into town just past noon. Sea Haven wasn't much. A single main street lined with clapboard shops, a pharmacy, a diner, and an old brick library that looked like it had been a schoolhouse in another century. As Daniel pulled into a parallel spot across from the diner, Max raised his head, ears perking. From the opposite sidewalk, a young woman stood outside the library, arms crossed, staring at the bulletin board near the door. She was tall and slender, with loosely tied dark blonde hair tucked under a wool beanie. Her jeans were scuffed at the knees and her brown leather satchel swung as she turned. Lucy Palmer, 28, taught social studies at the local high school and moonlighted as the town's unofficial historian. Daniel hadn't seen her since Kane's retirement dinner years ago, when she was just finishing grad school. She had a natural curiosity, the kind that never turned off, and a voice that always sounded like it was halfway between a question and a story. She turned as he crossed the street, her eyes squinting slightly in recognition. "Detective Hayes?" she asked, tilting her head. Daniel gave a soft nod. "Lucy Palmer. You were, what, Kane's assistant on that Veterans Archive project?" She smiled faintly, adjusting her bag strap. "More like unpaid scanner monkey, but yes. You're still here?" "Home has gravity," she said with a shrug, "and unanswered questions." He motioned toward the library. "Looking for answers?" "Always, but right now just updating the board." "You?" He hesitated. "Inherited something from Kane." Lucy's eyes lit with curiosity, but she didn't pry. Daniel hesitated only a moment more before saying, "You ever heard of something called Sky Harbor?" Lucy blinked. "The airfield?" "No," he said slowly. "Something inside it. A carving, wings, and a star." She was quiet for a beat, then stepped aside. "Come inside." The interior of the library was dim and warm, with the sweet smell of old paper and lemon polish. A single elderly woman read in the corner while a space heater hummed gently near her feet. Lucy led Daniel to a back room, small and cluttered, clearly her workspace. On one wall was a large corkboard pinned with photos, blueprints, and yellowed clippings. She began flipping through a drawer. "Kane used to come in here every couple of months," she said. "He never borrowed books, just sat and read old newspapers, never talked much, but he once asked if we had records on Operation Freedom Sky." Daniel raised a brow. "That sounds dramatic." "Military usually is." She pulled out a dusty folder. "Never found anything under that name, but I started digging around Sea Haven's war history. The base was a logistics and communications hub in the 1940s. Supposedly just refueling and maintenance, but there were gaps? Gaps? She held up a photo, a black and white shot of the airfield from 1944. "Here, this hangar, number 3, was listed as storage, but there are no manifests. No logs, just blank paper." Daniel's brow furrowed. "You think Kane left something behind?" "I think Kane didn't trust paper trails." Daniel thought of the carving, the wings, the star. It meant something. Lucy leaned against the desk. "You found something, didn't you?" "Maybe," he said. "Not sure what yet." At that moment, Max let out a quiet huff from where he had settled near the door. Lucy looked over and gave a small smile. "That him?" "Max, retired K-9. Knows trouble before I do." Lucy crouched and gently reached out. Max sniffed her hand and allowed a brief scratch behind the ear before returning to stoic silence. "Good dog," she said. "The best." They sat for another half hour, poring over the photos and clippings, trying to match anything with the symbol Daniel had found. Nothing matched exactly, but Lucy promised to keep digging. Before he left, she handed him a slim folder. "If Kane trusted you, there's a reason. Let me know if you find something real." As Daniel and Max drove back toward the airfield, the sky began to cloud again. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sea salt and rust. Daniel didn't know what lay beneath the C-47's floor panel, but he knew this wasn't just about inheritance, it was about intention, and Kane's whisper, etched in rusted steel, was only the beginning. The air in the old command office was dry and smelled faintly of mildew, paper, and salt, like a filing cabinet left too long by the sea. Daniel stepped carefully through the warped threshold, Max close behind, his nails clicking softly against the uneven floorboards. The sun filtered through cracked blinds and fractured streaks, catching dust in mid-air like particles frozen in time. This room hadn't been touched in years. Daniel ran a hand along the top of an old steel desk, its surface covered in a thin blanket of grit. The drawers were swollen from moisture and age, groaning in protest as he forced the top one open. Inside were brittle manila folders, most of them blank or full of aging maintenance logs. He flipped through them without much hope, already expecting disappointment, until he spotted a black leather notebook wedged at the very back. It was slim, worn smooth at the corners, and bound by a cracked elastic band. Daniel opened it slowly. The first page was filled with tight, meticulous handwriting, the kind only men trained in order and silence could write. Flight Log. Lieutenant CMDR Richard Kane. Operation Sky Harbor, 1943. Daniel's breath caught. He turned the pages carefully, each line dated and categorized. But instead of typical entries, fuel calculations, cargo manifests, mechanical notes, the contents were vague, cryptic. Delivery secured. SH protocol confirmed. Cargo Group 4 stored. C-47 Registry 8127. And over again a phrase scribbled into margins or boxed off at the bottom. Hold for coded ledger. Max gave a low woof behind him. Daniel turned. The dog stood near the far corner of the room, nose to the ground. He circled once, then pressed his paw deliberately against one of the floorboards. It gave the faintest creak. Daniel crouched beside him, ran his fingers over the plank. There was a small notch, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Using his pocket knife, Daniel worked the edge until the board shifted, lifting to reveal a shallow compartment underneath. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small tin box rusted at the corners. He opened it. A folded canvas map lay inside, hand-marked with red ink. Several points were circled with initials, some accompanied by dates. BP 1043, JS 1143, LLD 12-43. All of them connected by lines that converged back to one location, Sea Haven. Next to the map was a dog tag, Lieutenant Richard E. Kane. Daniel sat back on his heels. This wasn't just record-keeping. This was something hidden, something orchestrated. He snapped a few photos of the notebook and map with his phone. He didn't know what Operation Sky Harbor truly was yet, but he had a feeling it had never been part of the official record. That evening, back in town, Lucy met him at the diner, a squat little place with linoleum floors and chipped formica tables, run by an elderly couple who barely acknowledged customers unless they needed napkins or more coffee. Lucy slid into the booth across from him, tugging her coat tighter. "You said you found something?" Daniel placed the notebook on the table between them and opened it to the first page. Kane was flying something classified out of Europe in '43. He called it Operation Sky Harbor. Lucy's eyes widened as she scanned the page. "This isn't military protocol. These are private routes, unlisted." He nodded. "Cargo from Europe, coded destinations, repeated mentions of a hidden ledger." She flipped a few pages, her fingers trembling. "Some of these dates line up. Years ago, when I was researching Jewish migration routes, I found interviews from descendants of families who said their relatives had sent valuable possessions ahead to America by military transport. Paintings, jewelry, manuscripts, but the shipments were never documented. One family said they were told their belongings were lost in an air transfer reroute." Daniel leaned in. "Could it have come here?" Lucy looked up. "Portland has a large Polish and Austrian immigrant population. There are long-standing rumors of heirlooms sent out of Warsaw in crates labeled machinery. Some of those crates never arrived. Until now, I thought it was just myth. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a folder labeled Community Notes, Portland Jewish Archive. Inside were 3 printed letters, all recounting similar stories. Relatives who survived, heirlooms that disappeared, whispered names like Harbor Sky and The American Drop. Daniel's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. Unknown number, he answered. Hayes. A woman's voice responded, clear and assertive. Detective Hayes, my name is Rachel Lasky. I'm a historian with the Oregon Heritage Preservation Society. Miss Palmer reached out to us about your discovery. I specialize in undocumented migration artifacts, and I think I may be able to help. He glanced at Lucy, who nodded slightly. Rachel continued. There's been speculation about rogue Allied efforts to protect cultural heritage during the war, specifically when governments couldn't act officially. Operation Sky Harbor matches what we call a ghost archive, undocumented transport of items from war zones to neutral receivers. Daniel exhaled. So, this was real? Yes, she said. And if what you found is authentic, Detective, it's not just a historical curiosity. It's a missing piece of global heritage. He ended the call with a promise to send over photos of the journal and map. Lucy leaned back, sipping her coffee slowly. Do you think Kane knew all of this would come out? She asked. Daniel watched Max, who now sat under the table, eyes steady on the door. I think he was waiting for someone to find it, Daniel said. And I think Max just led me to the next step. The wind had changed. Daniel noticed it the moment he stepped out of the Sea Haven Library that afternoon. It no longer carried the briny stillness of an abandoned town, but a restless tension, the kind that draped itself around the edges of silence and turned shadows sharper. Back at the airfield, he parked his truck just inside the gate and killed the engine. Max leapt out with an ease that belied his age, his ears immediately pivoting, tail lowered, his posture alert. The German shepherd's muscles were taut under his sable and silver coat as he slowly swept the gravel path with his nose. Daniel followed him across the lot, passing rusted fuselages and crumbling concrete pads now mossy with time. The notebook and the map Kane had left behind were locked in a steel box inside Daniel's truck, but the weight of them hadn't left his mind. Neither had Rachel Lasky's words over the phone. What you found may be part of a ghost archive. That phrase lingered with unease. He spent most of the day marking the map against physical structures. Hangar 3 matched one of the oldest entries in the ledger, C-47, Bay 3A, Nov 43, and he planned to start there in the morning. But as he stood by the airstrip that evening, staring toward the forested edge of the property, his phone buzzed in his jacket. Unknown number. Again. He answered. Hayes? The voice was male this time, calm, polished. Detective Hayes, my name is Silas Marrow. I represent North Star Holdings. I understand you're the new custodian of the Sea Haven Airfield. Daniel didn't respond. We're very interested in acquiring that property, Silas continued. Our company specializes in revitalizing underutilized land. We'd be happy to make you a generous offer. It's not for sale, Daniel said flatly. That's unfortunate, Silas replied smoothly, as if he were commenting on the weather. This site is historically significant. We'd hate to see it mishandled. Sometimes relics from the past can cause a great deal of trouble when they come to light, especially when handled without proper guidance. There was a pause. Consider this a courtesy call, Mr. Hayes. I hope we won't need to speak again. The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone. Max was now watching him, ears up, sensing the shift. Daniel slowly tucked the phone away. That night, the fog returned. Sea Haven always seemed to welcome it, curling along the road like ghost trails. Daniel locked the gate and settled in his truck with Max, who refused to leave the front seat. Daniel had taken to spending nights here, half on instinct, half on the quiet pull of duty, the kind that didn't ask but expected. Around midnight, Max stiffened. He rose slowly, nostrils flaring, and let out a low growl. Daniel sat upright, his hand immediately brushing against the flashlight and sidearm tucked beside the seat. Then the sound came. Faint at first. A metallic creak. Movement near the fence. Max growled again, deeper this time, and jumped down from the truck, his body slicing through the mist as he bolted toward the northern perimeter. Daniel followed with his flashlight. The beam caught movement. Two silhouettes near the back fence line, crouched low. One of them had wire cutters. The other carried something tucked under a jacket. A crowbar? "Hey!" Daniel shouted, raising the flashlight. "Police!" The first figure bolted instantly. The second hesitated just long enough. Too long. Max was already there. With a flash of muscle and a snap of jaws, Max lunged. The man cried out as Max's teeth locked onto his forearm, yanking him down into the muddy earth with brutal precision. Daniel ran forward, gun drawn, just as the man kicked out, landing a blow that forced Max back momentarily. The man scrambled to his feet, bleeding, and fled into the woods. Daniel crouched beside Max, who stood panting, blood on his teeth but uninjured. A single strip of torn jacket lay near the fence, and in the soft mud, a fresh boot print smudged in panic. They'd come prepared, and they hadn't expected resistance. The next morning, Daniel called Lucy. She arrived in her dusty red Subaru, hair pulled into a tight bun, her expression serious. They walked the perimeter, Daniel showing her the prints and bloodstains. Max trotted behind them with quiet purpose, his eyes scanning. "They know," Lucy said. Daniel nodded. "And they're not just interested in real estate." "I might know someone who can help," she said after a moment. "He used to lecture at my university. He's a retired aviation historian, obsessed with Cold War logistics and off-the-books operations. If anyone can confirm whether these flights were ever logged or intentionally erased, it's him." "What's his name?" "James Whitaker. He lives out near Tiller Ridge." Later that afternoon, they drove together to a house perched above a wooded bluff. The property was overgrown but solid. A low cedar cabin with a wraparound porch, wind chimes made of aircraft parts, and an old satellite dish now home to moss. A hand-painted mailbox read Whitaker in faded black letters. James Whitaker opened the door himself. He was in his 70s, wiry and upright, with a neatly trimmed beard and piercing pale eyes that seemed to size up everything and everyone. He wore a flight jacket so old its patches had frayed into abstraction. "You brought me trouble," he said before anyone spoke. Daniel blinked. "I heard about the fence," Whitaker continued. "This town talks when it's scared." Lucy stepped forward. "We need your help, James. Come in." Inside the cabin was a museum of air history. Model planes hung from the ceiling. Photos of squadrons lined the walls, and a large map of Oregon air routes dominated one corner. James poured black coffee without asking and listened as Daniel laid out the discovery. The notebook, the map, the carving in the plane. When he reached Operation Sky Harbor, the older man stiffened. "You don't say that name lightly," Whitaker said, setting his mug down. "It wasn't official, never recorded, but I've heard whispers. Smugglers during the war? No. Preservationists. People who ferried priceless artifacts out of war zones and stashed them in unlisted locations. Always denied. Always denied. But the legends stuck." He turned to his wall, pulling down a faded photo. A C-47 unloading wooden crates. "This one landed in Sea Haven, October 1943. But the flight log? Gone. Someone scrubbed it." "Who?" Daniel asked. "People who didn't want those artifacts claimed. Governments, collectors, maybe both." Daniel felt the weight settle deeper in his chest. "They're trying to reclaim it, illegally." Whitaker gave a slow nod. "Then you'd best move quickly, son. The longer it stays in your hands, the more eyes you'll draw. Some of them don't blink." The wind had changed again. Sea Haven was cloaked in a morning mist so thick it blurred the line between past and present. The fog rolled over the rusted fences and weaved between the husks of forgotten planes, as if protecting secrets not ready to be unearthed. Daniel parked the truck near the hangar and stepped out, boots crunching against gravel wet with dew. Max followed close, his sable and silver coat dampening quickly. His ears twitched toward the familiar hum of silence, but there was something more in his posture today. A quiet insistence, a tension in his legs, as if he remembered something Daniel had forgotten. Lucy emerged from the passenger side, zipping up her light gray coat against the chill. Her red hair was tied up messily, and a leather-bound notebook peeked from under her arm. She looked more like a wartime correspondent than a history teacher today. "Same plane?" she asked. Daniel nodded. C-47, Kane's favorite. They approached the aircraft. The same cargo transport Daniel had found Max obsessing over when they first arrived. The door groaned as he pulled it open, revealing the cavernous hold still thick with dust and age. They'd brought gloves, lights, and most importantly, Kane's notebook and the small map Max had led them to. "Here," Lucy pointed, aligning the map overlay with the floor layout. "This marking matches the rear wall. If Kane hid something, it's there." Max was already ahead of them. The old shepherd pressed his nose against the back paneling, tail stiff, eyes locked on Daniel. Then he barked, once, and looked back, as if waiting. Daniel hesitated. The panel was intact, dusty, but seamless. Still, Kane's words echoed in his mind, words he hadn't heard in years, but which felt carved into the core of him. "Trust your dog. When he knows, you know." He crouched and ran his gloved hands along the grooves. A small corner jutted inward, barely a millimeter, but enough. With a flat tool, he pried gently until the panel clicked and swung open. A cold draft poured out. Behind the wall, in a hidden compartment lined with faded military canvas, sat a stack of wooden crates. Each was no larger than a suitcase, aged and worn, their corners wrapped in rusted iron and marked with black stencils in German, French, and faded Hebrew. Lucy's breath caught. Daniel stepped in first, pulling one of the crates carefully from its resting place. The moment he did, Max let out a low, anticipatory whine. Not fearful, but alert. Watching. Daniel looked to Lucy, who gave a slight nod. He opened the crate. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and layers of brittle paper, was a painting. It depicted a street market in Krakow, bathed in golden light, children chasing pigeons, a woman with red ribbons in her hair selling pears. It was signed M. Edelstein, 1939. Beneath it were several more paintings, each with similar pastoral scenes: cities before the war, musicians in parks, cafes lit by gaslight. They opened a second crate. This one held a cello, polished wood, strings carefully relaxed with initials AH carved in the neck. Next to it, a bundle of journals written in careful Yiddish, tied with a faded blue ribbon. A third crate contained documents, passports, birth records, letters. Daniel unfolded one envelope, aged brown with brittle creases. Inside, a handwritten letter in a spidery script. "To whomever finds this. These are the memories we could not carry, the world we left behind before it was erased. If you find this, please do not sell it. Do not hide it again. Let it breathe. Let our children's names be spoken. Let them live. In memory. In truth. Please." Sarah Weiss, 1943. Lucy sat back slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. These are people's lives, their legacies. Daniel didn't answer. He could only stare at the painting in his lap, a portrait of a man holding a child on his shoulders, both laughing. The man bore a resemblance to someone he couldn't place, but the child's eyes were hauntingly familiar. "Why here?" Lucy whispered. "Why hide them in an old cargo plane?" Daniel's voice was low, because Kane was trying to save something more than just artifacts. They kept opening crates. There were 7 in total. Each one held different fragments: harmonicas, silver kiddush cups, lace veils, even a small Torah scroll meticulously wrapped. One crate held nothing but letters, hundreds of them, written in multiple languages, never mailed, addressed to people who may never have survived to read them. The hangar echoed with silence as they stood amid the past. Max sat at the center of it all, his body calm, ears forward, as if watching over the memory of each item. Then, as if cued by something unseen, Max stood and moved toward one crate Daniel hadn't opened. He placed a paw on it and looked up at his handler. Daniel paused. "That one?" Max barked again. Inside was a single item, a leather-bound pilot logbook. Daniel flipped it open. The name printed on the inside cover, Lieutenant Richard Kane. But this wasn't the same book Daniel had found earlier. This one had entries beginning in March 1943. The writing was personal, emotional. They said, "Don't ask questions, just fly it." But I saw their faces. Mothers clutching paintings like lifelines. One boy slipped me a drawing of his sister, told me she didn't make it. He said, "Hide it, where no war can touch it." So I will. Daniel closed the book. His throat tightened. It was never about money or glory. Kane had taken the cargo because no one else would, and then he'd kept it hidden all his life, trusting that someday, someone, maybe Daniel, would understand why. Max lay down beside him, head resting against Daniel's leg, eyes closed. Lucy finally spoke. "We can't keep this to ourselves." Daniel nodded slowly. "No, we won't." The weight of it all pressed on him, not as a burden, but as a responsibility, a promise. The air turned colder than usual that evening, as though the night itself was holding its breath. A hard wind whipped across the tarmac of the old Sea Haven airstrip, rustling the frayed tarps that still clung to the skeletal wings of abandoned planes. The sky above was a moonless slate, pierced only by the blinking tower lights from the distance. Cold, indifferent. Daniel Hayes sat on the metal steps of the C-47's cargo ramp, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He was bundled in a thick army green jacket, collar up, a flashlight strapped to his belt. His eyes scanned the perimeter, and his fingers absently brushed the engraved badge on his hip, not out of habit, but as reassurance. Max sat next to him, alert as always, ears high and twitching at every gust. It had been 3 nights since they discovered the hidden cargo, 3 nights since Lucy copied Sarah Weiss's letter by hand and whispered, "This is history breathing." And just 2 nights since a dark SUV trailed Daniel for 10 full blocks before disappearing into the hills. That morning, a man in a tailored black suit with a narrow face and thin, dry lips had shown up unannounced at Daniel's front porch. He introduced himself as Trent Calloway, a legal representative from North Star Holdings, the same real estate group that had already threatened to acquire the airfield. Calloway, mid-50s, lean and reptilian in demeanor, wore a navy suit far too crisp for the mud he stepped through. His speech was polished, but Daniel noted the hollow behind his words. "We've reviewed the inheritance transfer," Calloway had said, handing Daniel a folder. "A number of procedural irregularities. Ownership, as it turns out, may be contestable. I suggest cooperation. For your own safety, of course." Daniel didn't take the folder. Max stood between them, growling low and steady. "You'll need a court order," Daniel had said. Calloway gave a practiced smile. "Or we could simply buy your silence. Everyone has a number, Officer Hayes." Max had barked then, so sharply it echoed. Calloway flinched, stepped back, and nodded politely before returning to his vehicle, a black Mercedes SUV, which peeled away with tinted windows hiding its secrets. Now, as midnight approached, Daniel couldn't sleep. He paced the field's edge with Max, flashlight in hand, memory heavy. Max, 10 years old but sharp as ever, stopped suddenly. His body stiffened, nose in the air. A growl rose deep in his chest. "What is it?" Daniel whispered. Then, from the far side of the fence, a click. Then another, soft metal-on-metal sounds, deliberate and cold. Daniel ducked behind a rusted fuselage. Max crouched low beside him. From the shadows near the northern hangar, 3 figures emerged. They wore black, with ski masks and gloves. One carried a crowbar, another a small flashlight. The third dragged a canvas bag of tools. They moved toward the C-47, eyes scanning for any watchers. Daniel's pulse surged. He radioed local dispatch. The small-town police station barely had 2 officers on night shift. He kept his voice low. "This is Officer Hayes. I have a break-in at the Sea Haven Airfield. 3 suspects, potentially armed, requesting backup." But as the intruders reached the cargo bay, Max leapt. His bark cut through the night like thunder. He charged the lead man, the one with the crowbar, and clamped his jaws down on the intruder's arm. The man screamed and fell, flailing as Max held tight. The second man lunged forward but stumbled on debris. The third fumbled with a flashlight, revealing his own face, a young man with patchy facial hair and a startled expression. Daniel shouted, "Police, get down!" But it was chaos. The second man picked up the crowbar and swung at Max. Daniel fired his sidearm into the air, one sharp crack. The would-be attacker hesitated. Max released the first man and pivoted toward the one with the weapon. Blood now smeared the ground. The 3 men bolted. 2 climbed over the fence. The third limped, his jacket torn, a large North Star logo patch dangling by a thread from the shoulder. Max, still ready to chase, stopped only at Daniel's whistle. Daniel secured the area, gun still drawn. Backup arrived 10 minutes later. Deputy Curtis and Officer Ramirez from Sea Haven PD. They combed the field, but the suspects were gone. Daniel handed over the patch Max had ripped loose. "Evidence, tied to North Star Holdings. They're getting bolder." Ramirez, a young officer barely out of academy, looked shaken. "They came to steal something? They came to erase something," Daniel muttered. The next morning, Daniel stopped by Lucy's cottage. The sun was just rising over the misty town, and she answered the door in a wool sweater, hair braided loosely down her back. "There was an incident," he said. "You need to be careful." Her eyes narrowed. What happened? He told her everything, the break-in, the patch, the lawyer's threat. She stepped back and picked up an envelope from her table. "Funny you say that. This was slid under my door this morning." Daniel opened it. No signature, just a typed note. "This isn't your story to tell. Walk away, or the airstrip won't be the only thing buried." He looked at her. "They're trying to scare us." "I'm not scared," Lucy said, but there was a tremor in her voice. "Just angry." Daniel placed a hand on the frame of her door. "You can walk away if you want. You didn't ask for this." She met his eyes. Neither did Kane. But he didn't walk away. They stood silent for a moment, the fog curling between them. Later that day, Daniel sat back at the airstrip beside Max. The dog rested at his feet, chewing lazily on a stick, as if last night had never happened. Daniel looked at the aging plane again and realized the burden Kane had carried for decades. The duty of memory, of protection, and now the danger that came with it. He rubbed Max's ear gently. "Guess it's our turn now." Max wagged his tail, not just in agreement, but as if he already knew. The morning fog had just begun to lift over Sea Haven when Daniel parked his truck outside the modest brick building of the Portland Museum of History. It stood dignified on a tree-lined street, wedged between an old bookstore and a cafe that still used handwritten chalk menus. A carved wooden sign above the door read, "Preserving the Past, Guiding the Future." Daniel stood silently for a moment, Max at his side, before stepping in. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, paper, and polished brass. Display cases shimmered in the natural light filled with war medals, faded photographs, and yellowing letters. Daniel approached the reception desk where a woman in her 60s sat reading a copy of the Oregon Historical Quarterly. Her name tag read, Mary Ann Foster, Senior Archivist. Mary Ann was short and broad-shouldered, her silver-gray hair pinned up into a tidy bun. Her wire-rimmed glasses rested low on her nose, and her sharp eyes scanned Daniel and Max with measured curiosity. "Officer Hayes, I presume?" she asked, standing up with surprising agility. Her voice was crisp but kind, the kind of tone earned from decades of dealing with fragile documents and stubborn board members. Daniel nodded. "I brought some items, artifacts, I believe, from Operation Sky Harbor." She led him through a side door into a private archival room where the air grew colder and quieter. Under fluorescent lights, Daniel laid out the most significant items from the cargo hold, the instruments, letters, and especially the hand-carved menorah wrapped in oilcloth. Marianne gasped when she saw it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she examined it. "This is Hungarian," she murmured. "Late 19th century. And this," she picked up a brittle envelope with Hebrew scrawled across it. "This looks like a prayer written by a child." "Officer Hayes, where did you find these?" Daniel recounted the discovery, the legacy of Captain Kane, the threats from North Star, and how the town had begun rallying behind him. When he finished, Marianne placed both hands flat on the table. "This is a cultural archive," she said. "What you've found is not just important. It's sacred. These aren't just artifacts, they're echoes of people who weren't allowed to finish their stories." By late afternoon, arrangements had been made. The museum agreed to officially authenticate and help document the items. With their backing, Daniel and Lucy reached out to heritage groups and local community centers across Portland. The word began to spread quickly among Armenian, Polish, Jewish, and Czech descendants, and so did the gravity of the discovery. 2 days later, families began arriving in Sea Haven. One of them was the Goldstein family, a middle-aged couple with twin daughters and an elderly grandmother in a wheelchair named Miriam. Miriam, 92, had grown up in Krakow before fleeing with her parents during the Nazi invasion. When she saw the tarnished locket with her family crest that had been found inside one of the crates, she wept openly. "I thought this was burned," she whispered in Yiddish. This is my mother's." She kissed Daniel on the cheek before holding Max's snout gently in her wrinkled hands. "You brought her back to me," she whispered. As more families visited the airfield, Lucy saw an opportunity. Back at Sea Haven Elementary, she asked her students to research the airstrip's past. Her class, a ragtag mix of curious, awkward, and big-hearted kids, began writing essays, poems, and even short plays about Operation Sky Harbor. She encouraged them to ask questions at home, to interview their grandparents, and to tell these stories in their own voices. One of her students, Sophie Tran, a Vietnamese-American girl with thick glasses and boundless curiosity, wrote a moving article titled "Wings That Carried Memories." It was picked up by the Oregon Chronicle and then quickly went viral in the regional press. Suddenly, Operation Sky Harbor wasn't just a whisper of history. It was a conversation across the entire state. North Star Holdings didn't remain silent. Their legal department sent another letter, this time threatening eminent domain if the property wasn't sold within 30 days. But now, Sea Haven wasn't alone. Retired veterans, local teachers, even artists from Portland came to the airfield. Some brought food. Some brought security cameras. Others came with signs that read, "Preserve memory, protect history." Lucy had organized a community open day at the airfield. Children wore paper pilot hats and handed out hand-drawn pamphlets. Max, freshly groomed and wearing a blue vest with the words "Honorary Docent" stitched on the side, walked patiently beside each group of students, guiding them through the C-47. "Is he really that old?" a boy whispered to Daniel. 10, Daniel nodded, "but he's got the soul of a 100-year-old general." Max stopped beside the wooden crate where the menorah had been found. He sat quietly, looking at the children as if encouraging them to remember what they were seeing. Daniel stood back, realizing that Max, once a silent companion in his grief, had become something else entirely. A keeper of history, a bridge. That evening, as the town gathered for a small outdoor concert beside the hangars, Lucy stood on stage and read from one of the student essays. Lanterns swung gently in the breeze above her, and the scent of cedar and popcorn drifted through the air. "We aren't just inheritors of land," she said. "We are inheritors of memory, and with that comes responsibility." Daniel watched her from the edge of the crowd, Max lying at his feet. It had been a long time since he'd felt part of something, since he'd seen his pain turned into purpose. And now, as music rose into the star-speckled sky and children laughed under string lights, he thought, maybe Captain Kane had always intended this, not just to protect the past, but to pass it on. The first light of spring broke gently over Sea Haven, casting soft gold across the hangars once wrapped in shadow and silence. A year had passed since Daniel had first stepped onto the forgotten tarmac, Max by his side, into what had felt like nothing more than decay and dust. Now, the air buzzed with renewed purpose. The place once called Boneyard of Wings had become something else entirely. Sky Harbor Memorial Center. The transformation had not happened overnight. It began the day two black SUVs rolled through the rusted front gate bearing the insignia of the FBI. Agent Linda Morales, a Latina woman in her early 40s with sharp cheekbones and clipped no-nonsense speech, stepped out wearing a dark blue suit and determination in her stride. With a background in financial crimes and organized smuggling, she was known for her keen intuition and her zero tolerance for corporate intimidation. Tall and lean, Morales radiated silent authority. When Daniel handed over the security footage from Max's confrontation with the intruders and the torn North Star patch, she said only one thing. "This is enough. We've been watching them for a while. You just gave us our way in." Within weeks, the dominoes fell. North Star Holdings, long suspected of laundering money through shell acquisitions and falsified land deeds, collapsed under federal indictment. Hidden accounts surfaced. Offshore bribes traced. Arrests were made, not just in Oregon, but across 3 states. The Sea Haven property had been part of an elaborate laundering route tied to stolen artifacts and illegal estate claims. Daniel watched it unfold, not as a spectator but as a witness whose truth had finally broken through the noise. In the wake of the crackdown, Oregon State Heritage Commission, along with private donors and survivor families, proposed the site be preserved, not as just a museum, but a living archive of memory. With backing from the FBI and the Historical Society, restoration began. The cracked runways were resealed. The main hangar was turned into a gallery of photographs, letters, and items from the lost cargo. The C-47 itself, with Max's paw prints still faintly visible on its floor, was refurbished and placed under a climate-controlled dome. Daniel, now wearing a different kind of badge, accepted the role of Honorary Director of Sky Harbor. Though the term was ceremonial, the respect was real. He often joked he still didn't know how to fill out paperwork for anything that didn't involve arrests or traffic violations. But the staff, mostly local volunteers and young interns from Portland State, looked to him for guidance and heart, and he gave both freely. Lucy became the center's head of research, a role she filled with the same enthusiasm and diligence that had once fueled her classroom lessons. Now, in her late 20s, Lucy wore her brown curls loose, often smudged with ink or dust from sorting through crates. Her youthful energy blended beautifully with the gravitas of the place, and her articles continued to draw attention across the country. But it was Max who truly stole the hearts of every visitor. The 10-year-old German Shepherd, with his sable coat streaked with silver, bent left ear, and quiet eyes, had become something of a legend. School children would flock to him, tourists took photos beside him, and the staff had even made an enamel pin in his image. On the front wall of the main exhibition hall, beside a plaque honoring Captain Richard Kane, there now hung a framed photo of Max with the inscription, "Max, Guardian of Memory, Loyal Companion, Silent Sentinel, Hero." It was a spring afternoon when a family from Pennsylvania, the Rosenthals, arrived. They were quiet at first, a couple in their 50s and a small boy named Eli, no more than 7, with thick brown curls and oversized sneakers. As they stepped into the gallery, Mrs. Rosenthal froze before a canvas propped gently behind glass. It was a vibrant oil painting of a girl by a sunflower field, signed with a looping C. Rosenthal, 1938. She brought her hands to her mouth and wept. "That was my grandmother," she whispered, collapsing into Daniel's arms. "Was lost after the war. We thought it was gone forever." Eli, watching the tears fall and unsure what to do, stepped quietly toward Max. The dog stood still, calm and unmoving, until the boy knelt and wrapped his arms around Max's thick neck. After a moment, he pulled something from his small backpack, a circular bronze token, perhaps 2 inches wide, attached to a thin leather string. "I made it at school," Eli said solemnly, hanging it on Max's collar. Etched into the surface were uneven but deliberate words. "Guardian of memory." Max didn't flinch, just wagged his tail once and leaned into the boy's side. Later that evening, as the sun melted behind the trees, Daniel sat alone on a bench outside the hangar, Max curled at his feet. The spring air smelled of cedar and fresh-cut grass. The place was quiet now, not with silence, but with peace. He looked out across the tarmac, no longer broken but reborn, and whispered, "You did it, Kane. You brought it all home." Max lifted his head, ears twitching slightly as if he too remembered. And in that still moment, under the soft glow of a sky that had once witnessed war, departure, and return, Daniel knew that he had not just inherited an abandoned airfield. He had inherited hope. Sometimes what the world throws away, God is quietly preparing for a miracle. A forgotten airfield, a grieving man, and an aging dog all seemed lost. But in God's hands, even dust can be turned into light. Through courage, love, and the quiet obedience of a loyal companion, memory was restored, evil was exposed, and hearts were healed. This story reminds us that God often uses the humble and broken to carry out His greatest purposes. You may feel forgotten or discarded, but heaven sees you, and just like Daniel and Max, your purpose may be waiting in the very place others have abandoned. If you believe God still works miracles today, and that every soul and story deserves redemption, comment Amen below. May God bless all who watch this story. Like, share, and subscribe if this touched your heart. Tag someone who still believes in miracles. And never forget, even in silence, faith is speaking.
The courtroom was quiet, but the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, as if every breath taken in the military tribunal chamber carried the weight of judgment. The American flag stood behind the judge's bench, unmoving, frozen like the faces of those in attendance. Captain Evan Cole sat motionless in his chair, his hands cuffed in front of him, dressed in the standard olive-drab uniform of a soldier under court-martial. His eyes were shadowed, not from fear, but from something far older: resignation, exhaustion, and a silence no one dared question. The prosecutor stepped forward, voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. On the morning of June 4th, Captain Cole input incorrect global positioning system coordinates for the airstrike on Sector Delta. That miscalculation resulted in the death of 4 American soldiers: Sergeant Callahan, Private Mendez, Corporal Liu, and Lieutenant Rivers. There were no enemy combatants in the area. The strike was friendly fire. The system logs confirm Captain Cole's ID and clearance. He had full authority, and he acted alone. There was a murmur among the observers, but Evan did not flinch. The judge turned to him, formal but solemn. "Captain Cole, you have remained silent through most of this proceeding. You refused counsel. You declined to present any defense. The evidence is overwhelming. Do you have anything at all, to say before this court delivers its sentence?" Evan raised his head slowly. His jaw was bruised from days in confinement, and there was a faint scar along his temple, fresh. He met the judge's eyes and spoke for the first time in the entire hearing. "I am not here to defend myself," he said, voice even and low. "Not because I am guilty, but because there are things that must stay buried, so others can live." The silence that followed was deafening. The judge hesitated for a beat, then looked down at the verdict prepared before him. Captain Evan Cole, for the charges of gross negligence resulting in friendly fire casualties, and for failure to uphold your duty in a combat zone, this court sentences you to execution by firing squad, to be carried out within 72 hours. There was no outcry, no shock. The room had been expecting it, but then the judge asked, "Do you have any final requests?" Evan paused. For the first time his eyes shifted, not to the prosecutor, not to the guards, but toward the corner of the room where a small black and white photo sat in the file. a photo of a German shepherd with bright eyes. "Coda," Evan whispered. Then louder, "Let me see Coda, please." A murmur rippled through the tribunal. The judge exchanged glances with the officers flanking him. "Your military K-9. He was decommissioned after your arrest." "I know," Evan said, "but if this is my last request, I want to see him, just once." The judge sighed. "This is highly irregular." "Irregular," Evan said softly, "is all I have left." After a long pause, the judge finally nodded. "Very well, the court grants the request. The dog will be brought to the base by tomorrow. Court is adjourned." As the guards moved to escort Evan back to his cell, he gave no resistance. But for the first time in days, something flickered in his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but a shadow of something not yet dead. 3 years earlier, in a dusty training compound on the outskirts of Kandahar, Coda was just another failed entry in the military K-9 roster. Injured during a live fire drill, shrapnel to the hip, nerve damage in his back leg, he was marked for early retirement. Unfit for service. Not worth the resources, the report read. But to Captain Evan Cole, Coda was more than just a damaged asset. He was a survivor. Evan had found Coda lying in the kennel, silent while the other dogs barked and paced. His ears were alert, but his body was still. His eyes, however, told a different story. They followed Evan's every movement, calm but piercing, like he was waiting to be chosen, even knowing he probably would not be. "He does not respond to standard command anymore," one of the handlers told Evan. "Trauma response. He freezes up. There is nothing more we can do." Evan ignored the comment. He walked to the cage, knelt, and said nothing. He just stared back. After a few seconds, Coda stood, slowly, with effort, and stepped forward, pressing his muzzle against the bars. The next day, Evan filed a request to take over full rehabilitation training. Everyone thought he was wasting his time, but within weeks, Coda began to respond, not just to orders, but to Evan's voice, his signals, his presence. They worked at dawn and at night. Basic obedience turned into advanced maneuvering. Coda relearned how to heal, flank, search, and take cover. But most importantly, Coda learned trust. They became inseparable. The others in the unit joked that Evan talked more to his dog than to any human, but Evan did not mind. Coda listened in a way no one else could. No judgment, no questions, just presence. Then came the mission in Khorzhal province, a volatile region crawling with IEDs and unpredictable ambushes. Evan's team was sent to evacuate civilians from a compound surrounded by enemy fighters. While sweeping the outer perimeter, Coda stopped cold. His ears snapped forward. He took 2 steps, then barked, sharp and low. Evan signaled the team to halt. A hidden landmine, buried just inches from the path, was triggered, but did not detonate. Coda's alert saved them. Moments later, they found 3 children hiding in a ruined stable nearby. Coda approached them slowly, tail lowered, posture soft. One of the children reached out, touched his fur, and whispered something in Pashto. "Farishte," the interpreter translated. They said, "He is an angel." That was the last mission they had together. A week later, during a routine recon in the northern hills, the team was ambushed. Gunfire erupted from both flanks. The comms were jammed. Chaos. In under 6 minutes, most of the unit was gone. Only Evan and Coda survived, retreating under heavy fire, Coda shielding Evan's flank the whole way. But when backup finally arrived, something shifted. Evan was taken into custody. No explanation. Coda was dragged away in the opposite direction, confused, resisting the leash, looking back with panic in his eyes. That was the last time they saw each other. Until now. The heavy steel door groaned open, and a wave of desert air slipped into the dim isolation chamber where Captain Evan Cole sat, chained to the floor. His eyes, hollow from days of silence, barely moved when the guard stepped aside. But then he saw him. Coda, the German shepherd, stood in the doorway for a second, as if unsure whether what he saw was real. Then his ears lifted, and without a sound, he walked forward. Evan's lips parted, but no words came, only breath, only disbelief. Coda stopped inches away, sniffed Evan's boots, and whimpered, just once, before lying down and pressing his head against Evan's knees. Evan dropped his forehead to Coda's. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, "you remember?" The room was still. Even the guards didn't speak, but that moment, man and dog, reunited after the silence of betrayal, was louder than any gavel. A few minutes later, Major Drenner, Evan's former commanding officer, entered the chamber with 2MP's clipboard in hand. "We're done here," Drenner said briskly. "Let's move the dog out." As one of the guards approached Coda, the shepherd tensed. Then, low and deep, he growled. Everyone froze. "Coda," Evan said gently, "it's okay," but Coda's eyes were locked not on the guard, but on Drenner. The growl grew louder. Drenner shifted uncomfortably. "Get the dog under control." Coda stood up, ears flat, his body lowering into a crouch. "Coda, stand down," one officer barked. But Coda did not move. Instead, he took one slow step forward, and another, eyes fixed on Drenner. The major took a step back. "What's wrong with this animal?" he snapped, reaching instinctively toward his side pocket, perhaps for a signal device or simply out of habit, but in his nervous motion, his fingers fumbled, and something fell to the floor, a small, black USB stick, nearly invisible against the concrete. Coda lunged, not at Drenner, but toward the object. He snatched it in his jaws and darted backward toward Evan. The entire room erupted. "Secure the animal! Hold fire!" Coda dropped the USB at Evan's feet and sat beside it, chest heaving. The commanding officer from the tribunal arrived moments later, alerted by the commotion. Evan looked down, picked up the device with his cuffed hands, and met the colonel's eyes. "Run it," he said. The tech unit was called in. Within 20 minutes, the contents of the drive were decrypted. Inside, encrypted targeting logs, time-stamped access credentials, edits, the original coordinates, the correct ones, and a second set manually altered by a login code registered to Major Drenner. There was no more room for doubt. The room fell to a hush as the judge re-entered and faced the assembly. "Captain Evan Cole," he said slowly, "in light of new evidence, this court finds you not guilty of all charges. You are hereby fully exonerated." The silence broke, not with applause, but with relief, audible, physical. One of the guards unclasped Evan's cuffs. Evan rose slowly, his legs stiff, his breath uneven. Coda stood beside him, tail finally wagging. Not fast, just steady, like the beat of a heart returning. Major Drenner was escorted out in silence, his eyes darting between the dog and the tribunal that no longer believed him. Evan looked down at Coda and whispered, "You knew." Coda did not bark. He only looked up at Evan with those deep amber eyes and sat, as if to say, "I never stopped watching." The war was over, not just on the battlefield, but in Evan Cole's heart. After his exoneration, Evan quietly declined the offer to return to duty. The military had cleared his name, but some parts of the soul were not meant to return to war. He packed what little he owned, signed the discharge papers, and left the base with Coda walking silently beside him. They headed west, away from bases, from cameras, from politics and tribunals. Evan found a cabin tucked beneath the trees near a small town in Colorado. No fences, no neighbors close enough to ask questions, just sky, pine, and peace. There they began again. Evan named the land Coda Haven. At first it was just the two of them. Then one day a former Marine named Travis showed up. Travis was 27, recently discharged, and haunted. He had lost his best friend in a convoy ambush and had not spoken more than a few words to anyone in months. He was sent by a therapist who had heard about Evan and his dog. Travis sat on the porch, arms crossed, head down. Coda walked over slowly, then, without command, lay at Travis's feet and pressed his head gently against the young man's boot. Travis did not move, not for 10 minutes. Then, quietly, tears fell. He reached down and rested his hand on Coda's back. That night, word spread slowly, not through advertising but whispers. Veterans who felt broken came. Dogs from shelters, many abused or abandoned, were paired with them. Coda became more than a symbol. He was the spirit of the place, walking silently from one soul to the next, sensing which heart needed presence, not pressure. Evan began to write. He put their story into words, carefully, honestly. The betrayal, the trial, the dog who had saved him in more ways than one. He started a podcast, simply titled The Quiet Ones. Every week, he shared stories of veterans and dogs who had helped each other survive. It spread far beyond what he imagined. Downloads from all 50 states, and then overseas. Listeners wrote letters. Veterans called in. Some cried. Some just said thank you. And then, one morning, a letter arrived from Kabul, written in careful English. It was from a boy, now 17, who had once been pulled from a crumbling building by a German shepherd with amber eyes. I remember his fur. I remember how he stood between me and the fire. I am alive because of him. I want to become a doctor so I can save people, like Coda saved me. Evan read the letter twice, then a third time. He sat at the edge of the porch, Coda beside him as always. He folded the letter, set it down gently, and buried his face into his hands. He cried, not out of grief, but gratitude. Coda nudged his shoulder with his nose, then leaned against him, quiet and still. Evan whispered through the tears, "We did it, boy. You saved more than me." Coda did not move. He did not need to. The seasons passed quietly at Coda Haven, and with each year the grass grew softer, the trees taller, and Coda slower. His muzzle had turned silver, his gait had grown stiff, and though he could no longer leap up onto the porch as he once did, he still greeted each morning beside Evan, ready for their slow, steady walk around the garden trail. Evan never shortened the path. He just walked slower to match Coda's pace, and Coda, for all his age, still kept up, each step heavy but proud, as if he knew the trail wasn't just a routine, but a promise. The veterans called it Coda's Round. Those who joined them in the mornings walked quietly, respectfully, knowing they were walking behind something sacred. One evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the hills, the air dipped cooler, still golden. Evan and Coda sat on the porch, shoulder to shoulder like they had countless times before. The light painted long shadows across the lawn. Wind whispered gently through the pine. Evan looked down at the dog beside him, his oldest friend, his quiet guardian. "You saved me more than once," he whispered, "even from myself." Coda didn't lift his head. He just shifted slightly, exhaled softly, and rested his muzzle against Evan's boot. His eyes closed, his breath slowed, and there, in the most peaceful silence, Coda slipped away. No pain, no sound, no fanfare, just the soft stillness of a warrior finding rest. Evan did not move for a long time. He sat with one hand on Coda's back, the sun fully gone now, night wrapping gently around them both. The next morning the entire sanctuary gathered at the edge of the woods, beneath Coda's favorite tree. Evan had carved a small wooden marker himself. No marble, no medals, just words that said everything. "He gave me back my name when the world tried to take it." Veterans laid small tokens at the base. Dog tags, notes, folded bandanas, not in grief, but in gratitude. Because Coda was never just a dog. He was proof that even when the world is broken, love, loyalty, and quiet courage can still hold it together, even to the very last breath. Some warriors carry no rifles. Some truths are never spoken aloud. And sometimes, the ones who save us do so without ever saying a word. Coda was not just a dog. He was a witness. a protector, a quiet force of loyalty in a world that had forgotten how to listen. He did not just save Evan's life, he gave him back his identity, his honor, and his will to keep going when everything else had fallen apart. In a time when justice seemed buried, Coda uncovered it with nothing more than instinct, trust, and love. No courtroom speech, no plea bargain, just a stare that saw through lies and a heart that refused to give up. Because sometimes justice does not need a voice. It only needs a pair of steady eyes and a soul that never walks away. This was Coda's legacy, and this is why we remember him. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey, the story of Coda, the loyal German shepherd who proved that some heroes don't wear medals. They simply stay. If this story moved you, reminded you of the quiet power of loyalty, or made you believe once more in second chances, please like, share, and subscribe to Amazing Paws Stories. Here, we honor the unspoken bonds between humans and their four-legged guardians. We share stories that heal, that inspire, and that remind us all, sometimes the greatest acts of courage walk quietly on paws. Hit that subscribe button and join a growing community that believes in compassion, connection, and the extraordinary power of animals to change lives. This is Amazing Paws Stories, where loyalty lives forever.